for this lecture, I'm going to argue that abortion is immoral, at least in the typical cases. We're going to consider a few arguments for the immorality of abortion and show that most of these are actually going to fail. Then we'll consider the more prominent idea that abortion is immoral because the embryo has a right to life, but also show that this argument is going to fail. Finally, I'll advance the argument that abortion is immoral because it deprives an embryo of a future like ours. Most people think that there are some instances where abortion is immoral, but others where it's immoral. And so to be helpful, we should be thinking about the same case. So throughout the following lecture, we're going to be using the case of unwanted pregnancy. Taylor just discovered that she's pregnant with M, a 6-week-old embryo. The pregnancy resulted from casual, consensual sex. Taylor didn't want to get pregnant, and her partner wore a condom. But they were aware that condoms sometimes break, which is what happened in this case. Both Taylor and M are healthy, and carrying the pregnancy will not pose any threat to Taylor's life. Even so, Taylor knows that going through with the pregnancy will be a huge burden, physically, emotionally, and financially. So Taylor decides to have an abortion, killing M. So this is considered the typical case because it happens within the first 8 weeks, which is when most abortions happen, and it also is the result of failed contraception. So further, this is the type of case that the two sides of the debate are going to disagree on. We can label those sides of the debate that we're talking about with the typical labels, pro-life and pro-choice. Generally, we can divide them as follows. Pro-lifers hold that it's immoral to abort M at 6 weeks. A pro-choicer holds that it was morally permissible to abort M at 6 weeks. So these are just general labels. Someone who is pro-life or pro-choice might also allow for exceptions. Further, this is really important. We are not talking about legal access for abortion. We are strictly here talking about the morality of abortion. Law and morality are going to be different things. So one can be pro-life and believe that a woman should have legal access to choose her health care. So for instance, someone might also think that adultery is immoral, but it's not illegal. So then on the other side, there are some minor transgressions that, like shoplifting a pack of gum, which are somewhat immoral. And a pro-lifer might agree that abortions are somewhat immoral to a relatively small degree. For this lecture, though, we're going to be focusing on the question whether abortion is seriously immoral. So that's the idea that abortion is as immoral as killing a typical human being. A common strategy in arguments for or against abortion are to identify some property that the fetus has or lacks and say that that is relevant to the permissibility of abortion. For instance, pro-lifers are going to try and fill in the X for this argument schema. M is or has X, so it is seriously immoral to kill M. So they might say that M is alive, or M has a heartbeat, or M has human DNA. Now, in contrast, the pro-choicers are going to fill in the Y for this argument schema to argue that abortion is not immoral. M is not Y, so it is not seriously immoral to kill M. For instance, they might say that M is not rational, or self-sufficient, or wanted. So we're going to look at these ways of making this argument separately, but first we need to notice that the arguments are not going to be complete. We need to add a principle that's going to take us from this observation that M has or lacks some property to the conclusion that abortion is immoral or moral. So the full argument schemas can be completed as follows. The X schema, X1, M is or has X. x2, it's always seriously immoral to kill something that is or has x. x3, so it's seriously immoral to kill m. In contrast, the completed y schema is y1, m isn't y. y2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it is y. y3, so it's not seriously immoral to kill m. All right, well now we can go on to consider some of the different properties that the pro-lifers and pro-choicers are going to use to fill in this argument and see how it is going to impact the permissibility of abortion. So let's start with some bad pro-choice arguments. First, we're going to start with the fact that M is not rational. Rationality here meaning the capacity of conscious reflection or using reasoning or logic. The argument from rationality can be formalized as YR1, M is not rational. YR2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it's rational. YR3, so it's not seriously immoral to kill M. So YR1 is obviously true. M is a simple being and she doesn't have a brain to, rationally think through things. But YR2 is obviously false. A newborn also lacks rationality, but clearly it's seriously immoral to kill a newborn. So this argument's going to fail. And other Y schema arguments are going to fail for similar reasons. For instance, you might think that it's permissible to abort M because M is not self-sufficient, meaning that she's entirely dependent on Taylor to survive, and she couldn't possibly survive on her own. So we formalize the self-sufficiency argument as YS1, M isn't self-sufficient. YS2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it's self-sufficient. YS3, so it isn't seriously immoral to kill M. YS2 here is going to be false for the same reasons that YR2 is false. It would be immoral to kill a newborn in the same way that it would be immoral to kill an elderly or a disabled person, just because they're not entirely self-sufficient. Nor is the fact that M is unwanted going to be sufficient to establish the immorality of abortion or the morality of abortion. So consider the argument from being unwanted. YU1, M is unwanted. YU2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it's wanted. YU3, so it isn't seriously immoral to kill M. All right, so to see why YU2 here is going to be false, consider a mother who has a pregnancy and gives birth completely in secrecy. Well, she doesn't want the child, and so no one else in the world even knows that the child exists, and so no one in the world could possibly want this child. But it would still seem completely immoral for someone to kill this child even though it was in secret. Similarly, it would be completely immoral to kill your friend who's super annoying even though they have no friends or family. So here, just being unwanted is not going to be sufficient for establishing the morality of being able to kill them. So pro-choicers need to find some property that permits them to kill embryos, but does not permit them to kill newborns. So one might think that M is physically attached to another person, whereas a newborn is not. So we can think about this as the argument from attachment. YA1, M is attached to another person. YA2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it isn't attached to another person. YA3, so it isn't seriously immoral to kill M. So YA2 allows someone to kill something that's not physically attached to a human. Okay, so a counterexample to this is going to be something that's physically attached to another human, but it would still be immoral to kill. Okay, we'll think about a newborn wrapped up in a little baby wrap and, attached to their parents. It would be seriously immoral to kill that person. All right, well, that might seem a little unfair. Maybe here by attachment, you don't mean this just physical attachment, but rather you mean something a little bit more. Something more about how like a fetus is actually attached to the mother. So we can reformulate this as the argument from bodily attachment. YA1 star, M is bodily attached to another human. YA2 star, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it isn't bodily attached to another human. YA3, so it isn't seriously immoral to kill M. So now the baby wrap counterexample is not going to work here. But now consider a newborn who hasn't had its umbilical cord cut. It would still be immoral to kill that newborn, even though it's still bodily attached to the mother. YA2 star would also say that it's morally permissible to kill a conjoined twin. Not both of them, but at least one of them, because it's bodily attached to another human. So the last difference maker here is we're going to consider the fact that M is not conscious, and she won't be until 5 months into the pregnancy. So this seems like it could avoid all the previous counterexamples, and we can formalize this as the argument from consciousness. YC1, M is not conscious. YC2, it's seriously immoral to kill something only if it's conscious. YC3, so it isn't seriously immoral to kill M. However, this isn't going to work either. Think about a human who is heavily sedated, or a human who is in a dreamless sleep. They seem to be unconscious. Nonetheless, it would be seriously immoral to kill one of them. So it seems like none of these pro-choice arguments are going to work. So some pro-life arguments are going to try and find some feature that M has that's going to make it immoral to kill her. So they're going to use that feature to fill in the X schema from the arguments from earlier. So first we can start with the idea that it is immoral to kill M because she's alive. This can be formalized as the argument from life. XL1, M is alive. XL2, it's always seriously immoral to kill something that's alive. XL3, so it's always seriously immoral to kill M. This argument is meant to capture the idea that life begins at conception. XL1 is obviously true. M is a living organism. On the other hand, though, XL2 is going to be obviously false. So you might be thinking about some of the more controversial cases like the death penalty or physician-assisted suicide, but we don't actually have to, use those controversial cases to show why XL2 is false here. XL2 is just saying that we can't kill any living being. And so it's saying that it's immoral for us to kill even a single blade of grass. But obviously that's not true, so we're going to say XL2 is false. So this shows us that pro-choicers can even accept that life begins at conception, but still maintain that abortion is morally permissible because XL2 is false. So pro-lifers might insist that it's the fact that M has human DNA. So we can formalize this as the argument from human DNA. XD1, M has human DNA. XD2, it's always seriously immoral to kill something that has human DNA. XD3, so it's seriously immoral to kill M. So this is going to avoid the previous counterexample. But XD2 is still going to be false because our skin cells and even cancer cells have human DNA, but it's obviously morally permissible to kill them. So next, one might think that it's immoral to kill M because she has a heartbeat. So we can formalize this as the argument from hearts. XH1, M has a beating heart. XH2, it's always seriously immoral to kill something that has a beating heart. XH3, so it's seriously immoral to kill M. So this can avoid the previous counterexamples. Neither grass nor cancer cells are going to have a beating heart, but a worm is going to have a beating heart. And so XH2 is saying that it's seriously immoral to kill a worm. But since that doesn't seem seriously immoral, XH2 must be false. So what about the idea that it's immoral to kill M because she is potentially going to become a human? So we can formalize this as the argument from potentiality. XP1, M is a potential person. XP2, it's seriously immoral to kill a potential person. XP3, so it's seriously immoral to kill M. XP1 here is true. If Taylor carries M to term, then she could become a full person, and so M is a potential person. XP2 here is going to avoid the previous counterexamples, because neither a blade of grass, nor any skin cells, nor a worm is ever going to be a potential person. But it's still hard to see why XP2 is true here. Just because someone is a potential person doesn't mean that we should treat them as if they have all the same rights as a full person. For instance, I am potentially the next president of the United States, but that doesn't mean that you should treat me as though I am the president of the United States. I don't have the same rights as the president of the United States. Furthermore, in the next segment, I'm going to show that even if M does have all the same rights as a full person, it still might be permissible to kill her. So what these arguments have shown us is that they're unsuccessful, and even pro-lifers shouldn't be convinced by these arguments. They should actually be looking for a better argument to show that abortion is immoral. So now let's turn to a different pro-life argument. This is the idea that it's seriously immoral to kill M because M has a right to life. So we can formalize this as the right to life argument. RL1, M has a right to life. RL2, if M has a right to life, then it is seriously immoral to deprive M of Taylor's womb. RL3, so it is seriously immoral to deprive M of Taylor's womb. Since abortion would be depriving M of Taylor's womb, RL3 is saying that abortion is seriously immoral. So this is going to get all the previous cases right. Neither grass, nor worms, nor cells have a right to life. On the other hand, infants, conjoined twins, and heavily sedated people do. On top of that, the right to life makes it more obvious why killing someone is immoral. In contrast, having DNA or a beating heart or on any of those other examples seem a little bit more arbitrary about, playing a role in the abortion debate. But this argument is going to have two major problems. First, pro-choicers aren't likely to accept RL1. They might say M potentially has a right to life, but why think that she already has it? More would have to be said to convince the pro-choicer of this. Second, even if the pro-choicer were to agree that M has a right to life, this argument is still not going to work. In the next segment, I'm going to show why RL2 is false. So before we can get to why RL2 is going to be false, let's think about why someone might believe RL2 is true. So we can formalize this as the requirement of life argument. RQ1, if something or someone has a right to life and it needs a certain something in order to survive, then it is seriously immoral to deprive it of that thing. RQ2, M needs Taylor's womb in order to survive. RL2, so if M has a right to life, it is seriously immoral to deprive M of Taylor's womb. So RQ2 is true. M does require Taylor's womb to live. She's not going to be viable outside the womb for another 17 or 18 weeks. RQ1 also seems to be true. If something has a right to life, then it also seems to have a right to whatever is necessary for life. However, RQ1 is going to be false. So we can see that with the following two cases. The violinist. During his morning jog, Riley is drugged and kidnapped. When he comes to, he finds himself lying in a hospital bed, connected by some blood-filled tubes to a woman in a separate bed. His kidnappers explain that the woman, Marissa, is a world-famous violinist. She was found unconscious, and they're trying to save her life. Marissa is in need of a complete blood transfusion, already underway using Riley's blood, which is going to take 9 months. Riley is told that if he unplugs himself from Marissa at any time in the next 9 months, she will die immediately. When the kidnappers leave the room, Riley sees his chance to escape. So, with a heavy heart, he unplugs himself and sneaks away, and Marissa dies as expected. The Rock. You've become completely obsessed with People Magazine's 2016 Sexiest Man of the Year, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. So obsessed, in fact, that the thought of living without him makes you physically ill, deathly ill. At this point, the only thing that can save your life is the touch of The Rock's cool hand on your fevered brow. The Rock is notified and told that you will die if he does not come visit in the next few days. But The Rock is a busy man and he sends his regards. You die as expected. Surely it would have been nice for Riley to stay plugged into Marissa, and likewise it would have been really nice for The Rock to come visit you and touch his hand on your fevered brow. But neither of them have a moral obligation to drop what they're doing and to come help others. By refusing, neither of them have done something seriously immoral. So both of these are supposed to be counterexamples to RQ1. You have a right to life, but it's not seriously immoral for The Rock to deprive you of his hand. And Marissa has a right to life, but Riley isn't doing anything wrong by depriving her of something that she needs. So we can formalize this as the violinist argument. VA1, Marissa has a right to life and needs Riley's blood in order to survive. VA2, it is not seriously immoral for Riley to deprive Marissa of his blood. VA3, so it's not always seriously immoral to deprive someone with a right to life of something that they need in order to survive. So you might think that there's a disanalogy here between these two cases. that in the violinist case, Riley was kidnapped against his will. But in the unwanted pregnancy case, M is the result of consensual sex. So we'll see how that's going to be relevant later. But for now, this is just enough to establish that RQ1 is false. And without RQ1, RL2 is going to be left unsupported. And so now we have no reason to think that the right to life argument should be convincing. So you might be thinking that even if RQ1 is false, something like it must be true. For instance, you think that it's probably seriously immoral for me to steal your parka when you're freezing to death in the Arctic, or for me to take your inhaler from you when you're in the middle of an asthma attack. But why these ones seem morally impermissible, whereas in the violinist case and the rock case, depriving someone of what they need to survive doesn't seem immoral? Well, the natural answer is that in addition to needing those to survive, you actually, they're your property, and so you have a right to them. In contrast, Marissa does not have a right to Riley's blood, and you don't have a right to the rock's hand. So we can revise the argument to take this into account. So we'd formalize it as the entitled requirements argument. RQ1 star, if something or someone has a right to life, and it needs a certain something in order to survive, and it has a right to that thing, then it is seriously immoral to deprive it of that thing. RQ2, M needs Taylor's womb in order to survive. RQ3, M has a right to Taylor's womb. RL2, so if M has a right to life, then it is seriously immoral to deprive M of Taylor's womb. So the revised RQ1 star here is saying that it is seriously immoral to deprive someone of something if two conditions are met: that they need that thing to survive and that they have a right to that thing. Now, we need to satisfy both of those conditions in order to get to the conclusion, and so we need to add another premise here, RQ3. But that premise seems indefensible, and we will talk about that in the next segment. All right, so now let's turn to that premise. Why should we think that M has actually acquired a right to Taylor's womb? So one might naturally respond that M has acquired the right to Taylor's womb because she consented to the sex, and therefore she consented to M using her womb. For instance, if I consent to using my sleeping bag, and then we go to a campsite, and at that campsite I decide to withdraw it, I've done something immoral. Once I've consented to you using my sleeping bag, you've acquired a right to that sleeping bag. Similarly, if Riley had consented to the procedure, then Marissa seems to have acquired a right to Riley's blood. And so it'd be seriously immoral for him to withdraw his consent after the procedure has already started, effectively killing Marissa. So a pro-lifer needs to establish that Taylor has consented to M using her womb, and that M has a right to use that womb in order to stay alive. However, Taylor did not consent to M using her womb. Actually, she took steps to avoid anyone using her womb. So why should we think that M actually has acquired a right to the womb? So one might propose that, again, Taylor freely chose to consent to the sex, which she knew could lead to pregnancy. Even though she didn't want to get pregnant, she knew the risks associated with having sex. So we can formalize this argument as the known risks argument. KR1, Taylor freely consented to have sex and knew that this could lead to M using her womb. KR2, whenever someone freely does something and knows that it could lead to certain consequences, one has consented to those consequences. KR3, so Taylor consented to M using her womb. KR4, if Taylor consented to M using her womb, then M has a right to Taylor's womb. RQ3, so M has a right to Taylor's womb. So one might push back here on the idea of KR4, that consent at any point can be withdrawn. Think about sexual consent. At any point, anyone can withdraw it. But there's actually going to be more troubling problems for this argument. For instance, KR2 is a ridiculous idea of what it is for someone to consent. To see how ridiculous this is, consider this example, the open window case. Astrid lives in a dangerous neighborhood with lots of hooligans. She has bars on her windows and keeps the window closed and latched for extra protection. One hot summer day, she opens the window to get some cool air, trusting that the bars will keep the hooligans out, though knowing that they're not 100% reliable. Unfortunately, the bars are defective. Some hooligans pull them off, climb through the window, and plant themselves on her couch and start playing PlayStation. Astrid clearly did freely open the window, and she did so knowing that there were hooligans in the neighborhood and that hooligans might come in. However, she clearly did not consent to hooligans sitting there playing her PlayStation. But KR2 is absurdly saying that she did consent to the hooligans entering her house. But clearly, consent is going to require something more than just taking actions that opens one up to risks of some unwanted consequences. Since KR2 is false, this argument is not going to work, and RQ3 is left unsupported. Now, it would be a completely different story if she had invited Taylor in to her womb by not using protection or trying to get pregnant. But the more typical case, when we're talking about here, the pregnancy is clearly an unwanted consequence of the sex.
All right, now here's our first chance to stop and reflect. Can you rescue the right to life argument from the objections raised in the last segment? For instance, can you find a more promising way to argue that the embryo has a right to the womb?
We've seen some really bad pro-life arguments. Even the right to life argument's not going to be that convincing. Now, let's turn to one that might be a little bit more convincing. The argument is going to turn on the idea that if Taylor carries the pregnancy to term, then M will have valuable future experiences. So these are going to be things like valuable activities, relationships, projects, achievements, or pleasurable experiences. Now, we say that M has a future like ours, or we'll call that FLO. Now, it's not necessarily exactly like ours, but still her future is expected to be filled with valuable experiences. And aborting M is going to deprive her of that future like ours, and that is what makes abortion seriously immoral. So we can formalize this reasoning using the simplified FLO argument. SF1, it is seriously immoral to kill something or someone if it deprives it of a future like ours. SF2, killing M deprives M of a future like ours. SF3, so it would be seriously immoral to kill M. So this is the simplified version of the argument. We're going to get a little bit more nuanced later, but for now, just to get the idea, we're going to use the simplified version. So SF1 seems pretty plausible. The idea comes from exactly what makes it wrong to kill a human adult. Well, the common response is that it's going to deprive them of what makes life so valuable. In this instance, a future like ours. And this is exactly what makes killing a kid even more horrendous, because it deprives them of an entire life of valuable experiences. So SF1 is just trying to capture this idea of what makes it wrong to kill a human adult. So SF2 also seems pretty plausible. Even if she has a rocky start to her life, by being put up for adoption or being raised in a low-income, single-parent household, it's still pretty plausible that M is going to have valuable friendships and major life achievements. So you might question, how will we know that she's going to have a future like ours? How can we be sure that she won't have a terrible birth defect or, die within being born, within a year of being born? Well, the short answer is that it's just stipulated by the example. The long answer is that, we can't be 100% confident that, embryos in the real world are always going to have a future like ours. Still, we can be reasonably confident that a healthy embryo and a healthy mother are both going to have a future like ours. And so this is going to tell us that we can be reasonably confident that it is seriously immoral to abort M. And since we can be reasonably confident that it's seriously immoral to abort M, then you shouldn't do it. Even if there's a small chance that it's not seriously immoral. So to get that idea, it's like this scene from a movie that I've never seen, but it was in the textbook. It was called Adam's Apples. And so apparently one of the characters shoots another character in the head, and in so doing, the bullet goes into the brain and it actually obliterates their brain tumor and ends up saving their life. So this could theoretically happen, but that's not going to justify everyone going around shooting each other in the head. So for this reason, it's going to be pretty tough to argue against SF1. Instead, we should consider 3 bad objections to SF2 in the following segment, and then in the segment after that, we're going to consider 1 good objection, and that's going to cause us to revise the argument. So some might think that the following case, or something like it, is going to be a problem for SF1. The hopeful goner. Guillermo has accidentally ingested a deadly poison and is in horrible, debilitating pain. He thinks he'll get better, but he's wrong. The poison is quickly spreading through his body and will kill him within a few hours. Isabella, who hates Guillermo, and would like to see him die as soon as possible, is attempting to inject Guillermo with a substance that will kill him instantly and painlessly. Guillermo resists and pleads for Isabella to stop. But Isabella gives Guillermo the injection, despite his protests, and Guillermo dies merely hours before the poison would have killed him. So even though Isabella is not depriving Guillermo of a future like ours, because he only has a few hours remaining and it's going to be filled with pain and suffering, she's still doing something seriously immoral. However, this is not going to be a counterexample to SF1, because SF1 says that depriving someone of FLO is just enough to make killing wrong. But it's not saying that it's the only reason that killing might be wrong. There might be other reasons that killing someone might be wrong, like refusing to respect their wishes. This would make the action seriously immoral. So second, one might object to SF1 on the idea that using certain forms of birth control, like condoms or spermicide, are seriously immoral because they prevent sperm and eggs from having future like ours. We can formalize this idea with the following argument. The contraception argument. CC1. Killing sperm deprives them of a future like ours. CC2. If killing sperm deprives them of a future like ours, then if SF1 is true, then it is seriously immoral to kill sperm. CC3. It isn't seriously immoral to kill sperm. CC4. So SF1 is false. However, CC1 is going to be false. No sperm actually has FLO. Even if the sperm does go on to fertilize an egg, what it does is it goes in, deposits some genetic material, and then dissolves and ceases to exist. So what about the egg? Well, SF1 prohibits the killing of something with FLO, but spermicide isn't actually killing the egg. Still, the sperm is prevented from becoming a being with FLO, and if you take this approach, we could adjust the argument as follows. The revised contraception argument. CC1 star, killing sperm prevents the creation of a being with FLO. CC2 star, if killing sperm prevents the creation of a being with FLO, then if SF1 is true, then it is seriously immoral to kill sperm. CC3, it isn't seriously immoral to kill sperm. CC4, so SF1 is false. So this is just going to move the bump in the rug. Now CC2 star is misrepresenting SF1. It doesn't actually say anything about preventing beings with FLO from coming into existence, but rather it just says that it's immoral to take an already existing being with FLO out of existence. So a third way to resist this argument is to propose an alternative to SF1. Remember that SF1 is the best explanation for why it's seriously immoral to murder another human. To reject this, we can propose a better explanation. One might propose that it's wrong to kill a human because they desire to have future valuable experiences. And so we can revise SF1 as SF1 star. It is seriously immoral to kill something or someone if killing it deprives it of a future like ours that it desires. SF1 star would imply that it's not immoral to kill M because M is just a very simple creature and she doesn't have a brain, and without a brain she doesn't have desires. However, SF1 now is too broad. It will now permit the killing of heavily sedated adults or a heartbroken teenager who's left without the desire to live, even if that desire or that lack of desire is going to fade over time. So now, since it's seriously immoral to kill these people, we have reason to reject SF1 star in favor of SF1.
Alright, now here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. In the last segment, I considered a competing account of what makes killing wrong. can that account be defended against the objections raised?
So although the 3 previous objections are not going to work, we're now going to consider one that's going to cause us to revise the argument. So suppose someone is trying to kill you, and the only way you have to survive is if you kill them first. Well, in that instance, it doesn't seem seriously immoral for you to kill them. Or take the following example. Cruel game. Mbako is prepared to detonate an atomic bomb in the heart of a densely populated city. He has kidnapped 2 innocent people, Okuye and Shuri, and he commands Okuye to kill Shuri. If she complies, then he will release Okuye and won't detonate the bomb. If she refuses, then he will release both of them and detonate the bomb, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Okuye tries to find a way to stop the detonation without killing Shuri, but Mbaku has thought of everything. So with a heavy heart, Okuri kills Shuri. So given the circumstances, it's not going to be immoral for Okuri to kill Shuri in this instance, even though Shuri has FLO. Unlike in the case of Hopeful Goner, the victim in this case is going to have FLO, and so it's going to be a genuine counterexample to SF1. So in light of that, then we're going to need to make revisions to the argument. So Cruel Game is showing us that it is permissible to occasionally kill someone with FLO. And it's because there are certain factors involved here. And we're going to call these FLO-Overriding Factors. So these can be defined as a killing involves an FLO-overriding factor if and only if that killing involves the sorts of factors that can justify killing a normal adult with FLO. So in other words, these are supposed to be some sort of mitigating factors, some sort of factors that are able to justify it. In contrast, someone being really annoying is not going to be a mitigating factor. In other words, that's not going to be able to justify killing someone with FLO just because they're really annoying. All right, so with that in mind, now we can revise the FLO argument as the modified FLO argument. So MF1, it is seriously immoral to kill something or someone if killing it deprives it of a future like ours, and the killing does not involve any FLO overriding factors. MF2, killing M deprives M of a future like ours. MF3, killing M does not involve any FLO overriding factors. MF4, so it is seriously immoral to kill M. First, MF2 is the same as SF2 from the previous argument. And MF1 is about as plausible as SF1, but now it's not going to be open to the counterexample. But it also now adds a new condition that is required to justify killing someone, and we need to check to see if that condition is met. MF3 is saying that that condition has been met in the case with M. Killing M does not involve any FLO overriding factors. Now, one might push back here and say that killing M does actually involve any FLO or does involve FLO overriding factors. But remember that an FLO overriding factor is something that's also going to be able to justify killing an adult. So let's consider some of these factors in Taylor's pregnancy with M to see if any of them are going to be FLO overriding factors. All right, so carrying the pregnancy to term would be a financial, physical, and emotional burden on Taylor. But are these actually going to be FLO overriding factors? Well, it doesn't really seem like it. So think about a parent who has a freeloading son who's completely broke. It's like they're not going to be justified in killing him just because, you know, he's not able to take care of himself. He's a financial, physical, and emotional burden on the parents doesn't mean that they're justified in killing him. And conversely, when, you know, children are having to take care of parents in their old age, just because they're not able to take care of themselves is not going to be reason enough for us to justify killing them. So in these cases are not going to be exactly analogous, but the point is that they do not involve any FLO overriding factors. So one might propose that carrying the pregnancy to term would force Taylor to dramatically change her life plans, like quitting her job or dropping out of school. So to see if this counts as an FLO overriding factor, consider the following case. Runner-up. Crystal struggled for years to make it as an actress, and finally gets her big audition. If she gets the role, it will catapult her to fame and fortune. As it turns out, Jacqueline gets the role. But Crystal is the runner-up and told if anything happens to Jacqueline, the role will go to her. So Crystal discreetly kills Jacqueline and gets the role. So having Jacqueline around is going to greatly disrupt Crystal's life plans. But that's not going to be enough to justify Crystal killing Jacqueline. Even if it completely derails Crystal's life, it's still not going to be enough to justify killing an adult with FLO. And hence this isn't going to be an overriding factor. So try and think of other factors that are involved in the case with Taylor and M. And ask yourself whether any of these factors are going to be FLO overriding factors. Well, it doesn't seem like any of them are going to be able to justify killing an adult, so they're not going to be able to justify killing M. And so we should accept MF3 that killing M does not involve any FLO overriding factors.
Right now, here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Can the violinist case from earlier be used to resist MF3 of the modified FLO argument from this last segment?
I've been arguing that aborting a healthy but unwanted fetus is seriously immoral, and we call this the typical case. But to be clear, there are many bad arguments for this position, like the right to life, or that the mother is responsible for the pregnancy because she chose to have sex in the first place, or the fact that life might begin at conception. Still, the FLO argument is strong and concludes that aborting the fetus in the typical case is going to be immoral. So what about non-typical cases? Can someone who is pro-life because of the FLO argument, we'll call them FLO lifers, allow for exceptions in non-typical cases? So let's consider 3 non-typical cases. The case of an unhealthy embryo, the case of life-threatening pregnancy, and pregnancies that result from rape. So first, we'll think about the unhealthy embryo. Well, it's going to depend on exactly how unhealthy the embryo is. If the embryo is going to die in the womb, or likely within the first few years, like maybe an infant with Tay-Sachs disease, then it seems like the embryo is not going to have a future like ours, and so it would be permissible to abort these fetuses. Now, in contrast, a fetus that is likely going to be blind or have Down syndrome, these embryos are still going to have FLO, and so aborting them is not going to be morally permissible. Now again, they're not going to have the exact same kind of life that we have, but they're going to have a future like ours. They're going to have a future filled with valuable experiences and connections. Okay, so second, can the FLO lifer make an exception when carrying the pregnancy to term would threaten the mother's life? Well, if the pregnancy also threatens the embryo's life, then it seems that the embryo is not going to have a future, and so not going to have a future like ours. And so in that case, it seems like it's definitely morally permissible to abort the fetus, according to the FLO lifer. But let's just say that maybe the mother is able to live long enough to carry the pregnancy to term, but then is likely going to die in childbirth. So then we need to see if this case is going to involve any FLO overriding factors. So we need to see if there's anything that would allow us to kill an adult with FLO. So let's consider the following case. Quicksand. Ahmed is drowning in quicksand. He has gotten a hold of Omar's pant leg and is frantically trying to pull himself out. But in doing so, he is pulling Omar into the quicksand. Ahmed is in such a panic state that he doesn't realize what he's doing, and Omar's pleas fall on deaf ears. Unless Omar stops by pushing him under, Ahmed will pull him in and scramble out over Omar's submerged body, killing him. So, with a heavy heart, and in order to save his own life, Omar kills Ahmed by pushing him under. What Omar did is terrible, but it's not seriously immoral. Ahmed's continued existence threatened Omar's, justifying Omar to kill Ahmed. So this would qualify as an FLO overriding factor. Analogously, if an embryo's continued existence threatens the life of the mother, then the mother would be justified in killing the embryo. All right, so now let's look at the third thing. can an FLO lifer make exceptions for cases of rape? So assuming the embryo is healthy and does have FLO, then we need to check and see if there are any FLO-overriding factors going on here. Well, let's recall the violinist case. One of the reasons why it's permissible for Riley to unplug from Marissa, a full adult human with FLO, knowingly causing her death, is that her dependence on Riley was a consequence of the actions of the kidnappers. This was something that was beyond his control. All right, so this is going to show us that the best argument for the impermissibility of abortion, the FLO argument, can allow for exceptions, specifically when the pregnancy is a result of rape or when the pregnancy threatens the embryo or the mother's life. All right, so a pro-lifer who does not want to make exceptions for these cases is going to have to find a better argument. But it would be difficult to see what that argument would look like, especially since we've now seen that the right to life argument and the potential person's argument are going to be deeply flawed.
All right, now we have 2 reflection questions before you go. We saw that the modified FLO argument cannot be used to show that abortion is immoral in cases of rape or life-threatening pregnancy. Can you think of an argument that does cover these cases, but that does not fall victim to the objections raised in sections 4 through 8? Okay, now here's our second reflection question. Consider the key idea behind the FLO argument, that M, the embryo itself, would have had a future full of valuable experiences had it not been killed. What does this assume about personal identity? Is the psychological descendant account discussed in Chapter 5 compatible with the idea that fully grown people used to be embryos? Is your preferred response to the too many thinkers argument discussed in Chapter 6 compatible with the idea that we used to be embryos?